December 6, 1941. The Eastern Front, outside Moscow. The biting wind whipped across frozen fields. German soldiers, clad in threadbare uniforms, shivered in hastily dug trenches. Their breath plumed in the sub-zero air. The great offensive, once unstoppable, had ground to a halt. Supply lines were shattered. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing. The order to attack Moscow should have been given. Every instinct, every strategic calculation demanded it. Victory was so close, yet so impossibly far. The entire fate of the German war effort hung in the balance. Instead, in the heavily fortified bunkers of the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler was fixated on another enemy entirely. An enemy he was not even at war with. His decision, made in a flurry of hubris and contempt, would echo across the globe. It would pull the sleeping giant of America into the European conflict, and in doing so, Hitler unknowingly signed the death warrant of the Third Reich. For the next 3.5 years, one question would hang over the Allied war rooms like a divine blessing. Why? The world in December 1941 was a maelstrom. Europe was largely under the boot of Nazi Germany. Britain, battered but unbowed, stood alone against Hitler's might. The Battle of the Atlantic raged, a desperate struggle for survival as U-boats hunted Allied shipping. In the East, the colossal clash between Germany and the Soviet Union had consumed millions of lives, turning vast swathes of land into an apocalyptic wasteland. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, launched that summer, had been planned as a swift, decisive campaign. But the Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, refused to break. And now, the brutal Russian winter had descended. The German war machine, designed for blitzkrieg, for rapid, overwhelming victory, was faltering. Soldiers were freezing to death by the thousands. Equipment seized up in the icy temperatures. Morale was plummeting. The dream of a swift triumph over Bolshevism was dissolving into a nightmare of attrition. Across the Atlantic, the United States remained officially neutral, but this neutrality was a thin veneer. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew the stakes. He understood that a Nazi-dominated Europe posed an existential threat to American democracy. The arsenal of democracy was already churning out war material, funneling aid to Britain and more recently to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Yet, public opinion was sharply divided. A powerful isolationist movement argued passionately against entanglement in another European war. Roosevelt faced a monumental dilemma: how to prepare a reluctant nation for an inevitable conflict while respecting the democratic will of a people scarred by the First World War. He needed a catalyst, a clear, undeniable act of aggression that would unite the country. He would get one, but not from where he expected. Our story revolves around 3 colossal figures, each with their own vision, their own destiny, converging on this pivotal moment. First, Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, a failed artist, a decorated but embittered veteran of the First World War. He rose from obscurity through sheer force of will, fueled by a poisonous ideology of racial supremacy and national grievance. By 1941, he was the undisputed Führer of the German Reich, a dictator whose word was law, whose decisions were unquestionable. His early successes, the annexation of Austria, the seizure of Czechoslovakia, the lightning conquest of France, had convinced him of his own infallible genius. He believed himself to be a man of destiny, chosen by Providence. He surrounded himself with sycophants, men who echoed his increasingly radical views. Dissent was not tolerated. He had an utter contempt for democracy, for communism, and for what he perceived as the weakness of the Western powers. Above all, he despised the United States. He saw it as a decadent, racially mixed nation, incapable of serious warfare. He often referred to Americans as a mongrel people, a nation of shopkeepers and gangsters, too soft and too divided to fight. This profound underestimation would be his undoing. Across the Atlantic, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, born into immense privilege, a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, a man struck down by polio in his prime, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Yet he transformed this personal tragedy into a source of immense inner strength, developing an empathy and resilience that would define his presidency. He was a master politician, a brilliant communicator, and a pragmatic leader. Roosevelt understood the complexities of global power. He had watched as Europe descended into chaos, and he had patiently, meticulously prepared his nation for the storm. He knew that the war against totalitarianism would be won not just by soldiers, but by factories, by innovation, and by a unified national will. His Germany First strategy was a testament to his clear understanding of the threat, but he needed a casus belli, a legal, undeniable justification to bring America's full might to bear. And finally, Winston Churchill, the bulldog of Britain, a man whose entire life had been a preparation for this moment. He had warned against Hitler for years, often ridiculed as a warmonger. Now he was prime minister, leading a nation under siege. His courage, his unwavering resolve, and his soaring rhetoric had rallied the British people in their darkest hour. But Churchill was also a realist. He knew Britain could not defeat Nazi Germany alone. He desperately needed America to enter the war. He needed their manpower, their resources, their industrial capacity. By the autumn of 1941, the global chessboard was set. Germany was bogged down in Russia. Britain was surviving, but barely. America was on the sidelines, a sleeping giant slowly awakening. Japan, however, was on a collision course with the United States. Driven by an expansionist vision for a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and a desperate need for resources, particularly oil, Tokyo saw America as the primary obstacle. Negotiations between Washington and Tokyo had reached an impasse. The Japanese leadership, believing war with the U.S. was inevitable, began planning a daring preemptive strike. Their target, the mighty U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The goal was to cripple the American fleet, buying Japan crucial time to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, in Europe, Hitler was becoming increasingly frustrated. The war in Russia was not going as planned. His armies were freezing. His generals were warning him of catastrophe. But Hitler, blinded by his own ideology, convinced himself that American material aid was the sole reason the Soviets and British were still fighting. He believed that if he could eliminate the American supply lines, the entire Allied war effort would collapse. He saw American involvement as an annoyance, a distraction, not an existential threat. On December 7, 1941, the world changed forever. Sunday, December 7, 1941, just before 8 a.m. The serenity of a Hawaiian morning was shattered by the roar of Japanese aircraft and the thunder of explosions. Wave after wave of Japanese planes descended on Pearl Harbor, raining bombs and torpedoes down on the unsuspecting U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack was devastating. Battleships were sunk or crippled. Thousands of American servicemen lost their lives. The news electrified the world. In Washington, D.C., the shock was immediate, followed by a surge of righteous fury. President Roosevelt, grim-faced, addressed Congress the next day, famously declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was at war, but it was war with Japan, crucially, not with Germany. The Tripartite Pact, signed by Germany, Italy, and Japan, was a defensive alliance. It stipulated that if one signatory was attacked by a power not already at war with that signatory, the others would come to its aid. Japan, by attacking Pearl Harbor, was the aggressor. Therefore, Hitler was under no treaty obligation whatsoever to declare war on the United States. He could have chosen to maintain neutrality, focusing all his resources on the brutal fight in the East. Strategically, this would have been the only rational course of action. Yet Hitler saw an opportunity. He saw America's entry into the war against Japan as a chance to seize the initiative. He believed he could unleash his U-boats into the Atlantic, sinking American shipping with impunity, before the U.S. industrial might could ever truly be brought to bear. He genuinely believed America was too soft, too distracted, too consumed by internal divisions and its war with Japan to effectively fight on two fronts. His hubris was absolute. On December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler delivered a fiery speech to the Reichstag. His words dripped with contempt for Roosevelt, for America, for democracy itself. He declared war on the United States of America. Hitler. A historical rectification, that of the American democracy, in whose name Roosevelt, along with Churchill, is working for the destruction of Germany, is a lie. He will not succeed. The cheers in the Reichstag were deafening. The Nazi leadership celebrated what they perceived as a decisive move. They had no idea they were cheering their own doom. While Hitler ranted in Berlin, a very different scene unfolded in the Oval Office of the White House. The initial shock of Pearl Harbor had given way to an almost palpable sense of relief. Roosevelt and his inner circle had known for years that America's destiny was tied to the fate of Europe. They knew Hitler was the ultimate threat, but they had struggled with how to bring an isolationist nation into a European war. Harry Hopkins, one of FDR's closest advisors, recounted the scene later. When news of Hitler's declaration reached Washington, the reaction was not one of dread, but of immense strategic satisfaction. The president reportedly leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face, and said something to the effect of, "We're in the war all the way now. This clarifies everything." Hitler, in his supreme arrogance, had just handed Roosevelt the greatest strategic victory he could have imagined. He had given America the moral and legal justification to unleash its full industrial and military might against the Third Reich. The Germany First strategy, once a political tightrope walk, was now a clear path. And in London, a similar moment of profound relief unfolded. Winston Churchill, who had spent months, even years, pleading, cajoling, and praying for American entry into the European conflict, received the news. He famously wrote in his memoirs, "No American will think the worse of me if I honestly declare that I had no doubt where I stood. I was sure that we had won the war." He meant it. He knew that the vast, untapped resources of the United States, now fully committed, meant the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany was inevitable. He later said that night he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. For Britain, salvation had arrived not in the form of a new weapon, but in the form of Hitler's own colossal blunder. The immediate consequence of Hitler's declaration was an unleashing of American productive capacity on an unprecedented scale. The arsenal of democracy shifted into overdrive. Factories that had been making cars began producing tanks. Washing machine plants churned out aircraft parts. Shipyards worked around the clock. Consider the numbers: over 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, and 6,500 naval vessels would be built by the United States during the war. These staggering figures represented a torrent of material that Germany, already stretched to its limits, could never hope to match. Hitler's decision was the moment the balance of power irrevocably shifted. Germany had gained an enemy, but it had lost the war. The burden of this secret, the catastrophic implications of this single irrational decision, would gnaw at the German high command for the remainder of the conflict. While they would fight with ferocity, the strategic writing was on the wall. The path to victory, which had always been tenuous, now ceased to exist.
The years that followed December 1941 were brutal. The war escalated on all fronts. The Eastern Front became a meat grinder. Allied bombing campaigns systematically dismantled German industry. The U-boat menace, though initially successful, was eventually countered by Allied technological superiority and overwhelming production. The long, bloody march to Berlin began. For the German people, for many soldiers and officers, the question lingered: why? Why had they voluntarily taken on the might of America? Hitler's public pronouncements never wavered in their conviction, but behind closed doors, some of his most astute generals and advisors recognized the enormity of the mistake. They saw the impossible challenge ahead, the sheer crushing weight of American and British industrial power, combined with the relentless Soviet pressure from the East. The war became a desperate struggle for survival, a grinding attrition that Germany, with its finite resources and dwindling manpower, could never win. Every lost tank, every downed plane, every sunken U-boat was a testament to the industrial juggernaut Hitler had carelessly unleashed. By 1945, the Third Reich was in ruins. The once mighty Wehrmacht was shattered. Hitler, holed up in his bunker, was a shadow of his former self, still issuing delusional orders as the Soviets closed in. His hubris had led him and his nation to utter destruction. The emotional payoff for the Allies, for the world, was immense. The liberation of concentration camps revealed the true horrors of the Nazi regime. The triumph of democracy over fascism was complete. And at the heart of that victory, often unstated, lay the memory of a single fateful decision. The realization of the sheer strategic stupidity of Hitler's December 11th declaration wasn't immediate for everyone. But with the perspective of hindsight and the declassification of documents, the scale of his miscalculation became crystal clear to historians. It was a moment of profound dramatic irony. The enemy, in a fit of overconfidence, had signed his own death warrant, much to the silent relief of those he sought to destroy. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States stands as one of the most astonishing strategic blunders in military history. It perfectly encapsulates the danger of unchecked hubris, the fatal flaw of dictatorships. Hitler's contempt for America, his belief in its weakness, blinded him to the reality of its potential. He underestimated the will, the resilience, and the sheer productive power of a unified democratic nation. The lesson is profound. Wars are not just won by tactical brilliance on the battlefield, but by the fundamental strength of a nation's industry, its resources, and the resolve of its people. By bringing the United States into the European theater, Hitler guaranteed his own defeat. The arsenal of democracy became the hammer that crushed the Third Reich. This single tipping point, made in a moment of arrogant folly, ensured that a complex global conflict, once hanging in a precarious balance, would ultimately be unwinnable for the Axis powers. It was the moment the world held its breath, and then, slowly, exhaled in profound relief, knowing that the inevitable had arrived.
Hitler's final days were spent in a desperate, delusional bunker, denying the reality that his own misjudgment had brought about. Roosevelt, though he would not live to see the final victory, had set the course for it. Churchill, the grateful ally, would witness the triumph. Their lives, their decisions, converged on that cold December day in 1941, one driven by fatal hubris, the others by a patient strategic resolve. The question of why is answered by a simple truth. Sometimes the greatest enemy of a tyrant is himself. The story of this single fatal decision is a powerful reminder that wars are won not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of leaders. If you want to understand the hidden turning points of history, subscribe for more stories like this every day.